You wake up at 6 a.m. to the USSR's anthem playing on your radio. The day of the model Soviet citizen has begun. You must get ready and hurry to your factory. You pay a quick visit to the toilet room, and there is no toilet paper. The last issue of the Truth newspaper plays its role, and only after using the Soviet truth for all it's really worth can you finally head out. Check literally any Russian forum, and you will learn that the case I described is not an exaggeration. The superpower that sent the first man to space and competed with the almighty America for about 50 years lacked such trivial yet important consumer goods as women's tampons, chewing gum, even iconic Sgushonga condensed milk every Tarkov player knows was a rarity. More complex things like electronics, home appliances, and cars were even less widespread. For an ordinary citizen, the Soviet Union was probably the poorest industrial economy in the world. In the previous video, we learned that the external factors that people often cite as causes of Soviet economic misfortune weren't external at all, but direct consequences of the Bolsheviks' actions who chose to risk the nation's future for their own gain. In this video, I will discuss why the Soviets failed even when they really tried. After all, if your policy is suboptimal, no amount of effort put into it will suffice.
I like this private ownership. I want to be left alone.
In an ideal Marxist world, the people should own the means of production. But in real communism, both the people and the means of production are controlled by a totalitarian state that claims to act on their behalf. So, the main problem of a realistic command economy is that it satisfies the needs of the state, not the people. In an ideally efficient market, prices are determined by the pure willingness of the people to pay for a given good. And other actors, mostly suppliers, respond to it, creating a self-regulating system. Sure, there are distortions, crises, monopolies, but generally it
just works.
Otherwise, market economies wouldn't be as prevalent as they are now. In a planned economy, the planner's view on what people need determines the prices. If a Gosplan official says that people need exactly 5 underwear sets a year and that they should spend no more than 5% of their monthly income on them, then so be it. If the people start buying up the underwear like crazy for some reason, it will take time before the news reaches the Gosplan, and the shortage will be resolved in 4 years or so because nobody will change the current great plan for some stupid underwear. In a market economy, the store would have raised the prices and cooled off the initial demand. The distributors and factory owners would jump on the opportunity to gain higher margins, and the deficit would end before some big-brain populist politician wins elections promising to make underwear production great again. Normally. Basically, feedback in a command economy is inherently slow and flawed. If there are no prices, then you can theoretically estimate demand through questionnaires, but just imagine asking even a small sample of maybe 2,000 people about tens of thousands of good types a person in the industrial economy can consume, and imagine doing this every year and then analyzing it to make decisions. During the early industrial development, it may work. If your nation has no electric plants, railways, or textile factories, then it's a no-brainer to build one starting from the most populated cities like Moscow with millions of people. The demand will be there. But when the most obvious investments dry up, you need to take well-calculated risks to continue to grow. Should we build a bread factory in this small town of 10,000 people in the middle of Siberia? Maybe try to venture into some new industry like cybernetics? Will this cute game called Tetris have enough of a player base to justify building a new facility for it? These are all questions you can't really answer in a command economy because of distorted prices and a lack of feedback. The second big problem is the reluctance to cut the dead weight because it may be a dead weight, but it's our dead weight. It occurs even in market economies as large vertically integrated corporations simply can't let go of part of their businesses even if they are unprofitable, sluggish, or not well received by consumers, hoping to maintain extra secure supply chains or just save face. Think of Samsung Semiconductor, with people praying that their Galaxy phone will come with a Snapdragon and not an Exynos chip, or Intel Foundry, which was unable to progress past 10 nanometers for years, but still got orders from its mother company. And multiply that by 10 or maybe even 100 because the USSR was far bigger than any corporation. With about 300 million people and a GDP of 4.5 trillion today's dollars in 1989. The Soviets loved to place industries to provide employment, even if it made no economic sense, like having multiple paper mills near Tbilisi despite Georgia having no industrial lumber whatsoever, or building construction material factories in remote Arctic towns like Monchegorsk, even if shipping these materials instead of processing them on site would have been far easier and cheaper. You can tolerate some dead weight, especially if you have an extremely successful industry that pays for all the others, but not for long and not on the scale of entire cities and regions. Now imagine you're a Soviet planner trying to, well, plan, but you have no people set prices to estimate demand. You must avoid closing existing unprofitable enterprises to keep employment rates, and you must explain your decisions with references to Marx and Lenin the same way a Christian scholar would reference the Bible to show how good a communist you are. Terrible job if you ask me, especially the latter part. However, even if you do everything you can to improve the lives of your compatriots, you can't fight the remaining elephant in the room, the military. The guns over butter meme originates from early 1900s, and by 1930s it was already well established, so even bad and Germans used it. Probably the funniest example of that was Goering saying, "Guns make us powerful while butter makes us fat." He probably just really liked butter. Everybody knows that fascism is inherently a militaristic ideology. I mean, just look how they are dressed. But communists should be different, right? World peace, welfare of the ordinary people, and yada yada. The real communists seem to agree if we judge by their propaganda posters and quotes, but with an asterisk. All that would be achieved in a totally communist world, where there would be no so-called capitalist nations left. But until the mythical worldwide revolution is completed, IRL communists would create one of the most militarized societies on Earth. Most people are aware of International Women's Day on March 8. Far fewer know that there is a men's version celebrated on November 19th. And out of these who know, literally nobody is from Russia or former Soviet Union, because the main men's holiday here was and still is very peacefully named the Defender of Fatherland's Day, held on February 23rd, which is funny because that's exactly the day the Soviets capitulated and accepted German terms, leading to the humiliating Brest-Litovsk Treaty on 1918, but that's another story. The USSR was so pacifist that a man was considered first and foremost a soldier, and would be fooled by the defender part of it. The Soviet Union has been on the defending side only once in its history, during the Second World War, and even that's questionable considering the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Militaristic tendencies didn't end with Stalin, and while his successors weren't starving their populace to death to keep up with the West in the Cold War, the USSR remained a very militaristic nation. By the end of 1980s, the Union was spending about 15% of its GDP on the military, or about 40% of its budget, which is the level of pre-industrial societies like the Roman Empire, except back then the military was the biggest institution a state could spend its money on. But the USSR was an industrialized country, so in theory it must have had a much lower military expenditure to free up the resources for welfare and other investments in physical and human capital. For reference, the most militarized Western nation, the US, had about 4 times lower portion of its economy, or about 3.5% of its GDP dedicated to warfare. And when you see massive Soviet military depots with thousands of tanks and guns collecting dust, you might think that it's really cool for a nation 3 times poorer than the US on a per capita basis. But in reality, just a testament to how militarized the Union was, compensating for a lack of total size of the economy with a higher share of it dedicated to warfare. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet military inventory exceeded that of the US by 3.5 times in tanks, 3 times in APCs and IFVs, 5 times in artillery, 2.5 times in submarines, and by 30% in aircraft. As Voltaire would have said, where some states have a military-industrial complex, the Soviet military-industrial complex has a state. We'll see the stark contrast between the Soviet military might and the depressive state of its consumer economy in the last section. But now let's talk about your favorite, how politicians mess with the economy once again. The Soviet Union wasn't considered a high-tech country, and rightfully so, but the reason for that wasn't its people. We all know that Russians, Ukrainians, Estonians, and other nations of the former USSR are quite capable of tech now, producing search engines, entire ecosystems, video games, and even implementing full digital governance. This is often attributed to the Soviet education system, which heavily emphasized math and sciences to the detriment of the liberal arts and social studies. After all, you need engineers to create military hardware, and math usually doesn't question the government, so you can teach it and not risk a revolution. The reason the USSR wasn't a tech superpower in mostly internal politics. The first obvious facet of it is ideology. The late Russian Empire and the early Soviet Union were quite advanced in genetics, with Nikolai Vavilov laying the foundation of modern crop breeding and genetic preservation. However, he had a fatal flaw of adhering to mainstream Mendelian genetics, which postulates that inherited genetic traits for a given species are fixed and acquired traits can't be passed down to its children. The notion that a living being can't be improved or changed through effort is inherently anti-Marxist, as one of the core premises of it is that a person is basically a blank sheet shaped by the institutions, social systems, crises, traumas, and other external factors. So it is possible to create a perfect communist man not corrupted by the bad isms like capitalism. While Marx himself never extended such a view to every creature on this earth, Stalin did, so Vavilov was imprisoned in 1940 and died of disease in 1943. Many of you may think this was just evil Stalin, but the ban on mainstream genetics persisted until the end of the good guy Khrushchev's reign in 1964. The second facet is that there is just too much dependent on the bureaucrat's personality. Since an official in a communist state has almost unlimited power in his field, he can veto every change he's too afraid or arrogant to accept without much explanation. In the mid-1950s, Soviet computers were roughly on par with the Western ones. Initially, their development was also constrained by ideology. Leonid Kondorovich, the only Soviet or Russian economist to ever receive the Nobel Prize and the godfather of linear programming, was shamed as anti-Marxist since his optimization works implied that you can calculate the optimal value of a good based on its scarcity, which looks like the marginalist theory of value, aka the goods price is determined by how much people are willing to pay for it, a direct opposite to Marxist labor theory of value, aka the goods price is determined by amount of work put into its production. By the time the ideological position weakened, the Soviets already lagged behind in hardware, so they switched to reverse engineering Western mainframes instead. But the Soviet Union got its second chance in late 1970s and early 1980s, when some experimental models like Mir or Electronica were created. Sadly for the Soviet tech industry, this time they would be crushed not by ideology but by bureaucratic conservatism. Meet Nikolai Gorshkov, the Deputy Minister of Radio Industry of the Union from 1974 to 1986. His photo may not be the highest quality ever imaginable, but his quote is truly golden and still a notable meme on the Russian internet. When several young engineers showed him the prototype of the first Soviet personal computer named Micro 80 or Micro 80 to gather funding, he said,
Guys, stop wasting time on nonsense. There's no such thing as a personal computer. You can have a personal car, a personal pension, a personal dacha. Do you even know what a computer is? A computer is 100 square meters of floor space, 25 maintenance staff, and 30 liters of spiritus per month!
And no, my dear Russian stereotype enjoyers, alcohol here is not for the stuff to drink, although it was probably used in that way too, but to maintain the computer, clear its components from flux residues and dust them. Anyway, that's how the Soviet tech ended, first deemed as anti-Marxist, then as too risky. We talked plenty about self-imposed limitations the Soviet economy had to work with. Now let's switch to what it had achieved. Let's continue with our model Soviet Citizens Day from the intro. After yielding the truth for a secondary purpose, you sit down for a breakfast prepped by your wife. Statistically, you're eating as many calories as an American. But look closer at your plate. It's a mountain of oat porridge and 2 slices of rye bread with butter, cheese, and Dr. Square sausage on them. By the way, this sausage has a history. To get it, your cousin spent 6 hours on a sausage train, traveling from your provincial town to Moscow just because the local shelves have been empty for weeks. You wash it down with a glass of sugary tea. You feel sated, but a nutritionist would have had mixed feelings. You didn't consume anything too unhealthy, but you also didn't get much protein. Just a band of good old and cheap carbs. You head out to your job. You didn't choose this factory. The state chose it for you through distribution. After finishing your trade school, you were sent here for a mandatory 3 years. It's a bit of a gamble. One day you're a student in Comfy Moscow. The next you're an engineer in Siberian town where the wind hurts your face. But it achieves near zero unemployment, so it has at least some positives, I guess. As you walk through your micro-district and think about how Soviet urban planning is clearly superior to American, you notice your shoes are pinching. Soviet footwear is an anomaly. You buy 50% more shoe pairs than an American every year, yet you also repair them 5 times more frequently. You make it to the nearest bus station. It's only 10 minutes by foot, same as the schools, groceries, or even local cinemas. And after a half-hour ride to the factory, you finally reach your workplace. You work for 4 hours, and then there is the best time of the day, an hour-long lunch break you like to spend with your colleagues in the factory's canteen. Your lunch consists of borscht soup as a first dish, 2 chicken cutlets with potato mash as a second dish, a light carrot cabbage salad, and a traditional Tsar non-alcoholic beverage called kisel. This is the source of roughly half of your daily calories and most healthy and fulfilling meal today. After yet another 4 hours of work, you head home by the same bus. You get to your apartment, which is by the way 4 times smaller than an American house. You need to do laundry, wash the dishes, maybe even vacuum a bit. Luckily for you, there is a special person for that, your wife. Don't get me wrong, using women as biological Mr. Handys was common everywhere since time immemorial, but in the USSR it's aggravated by a severe lack of home appliances. Consider laundry. In the West, this means pushing a button on an automatic machine. For a Soviet woman, it's a workout. Her manual washing machine is essentially a vibrating tub. It has to fill it by hand, watch it, drain it, and then use the hand wringer to squeeze the water out. And that's if she is lucky and has a washing machine at all. 40% of Soviet families don't have even that. To add salt to injury, after finishing this domestic shift, she still needs to prepare for tomorrow, because she works as a teacher at a local school. Soviet women were true gigachadesses of their time, working both at home and outside of it, all while the Soviet state claimed that it liberated them from patriarchy. But hey, at least modern Western scholars can say that they had better sex or something. If you need to call your mother to tell her how awesome your wife is, you most likely won't do it from your apartment. Only 10% of Soviet families have a telephone, compared to 90% in America. You have to walk down the hall, knock on the door of the wealthy neighbor, and ask to use theirs. They will most likely let you, because in a world with no goods, reputation is the only currency that matters. Finally, you sit down in front of your TV. It's a bulky black and white unit. Color models are very rare. You have exactly 2 channels. On the first one, it's literally named the third channel. A man in a grey suit explains that the USSR has just broken another record in wind production. On the second one, a documentary about how the US dollar is on the verge of collapse because it lost 0.1% of its value recently. Nothing fancy, but it still makes a leftover pasta serving as your dinner a bit less boring. There is no Hollywood blockbuster, and even Soviet movies are quite rare. This is why you, like almost every other Soviet citizen, are a voracious reader. You consume books and magazines almost at an American rate, not just because the state loves teaching you the communist ideals through literature, but because there is literally nothing else to do. You spend the evening drinking vodka, a third more than your Western counterparts, but this is to be expected, and playing cards with friends in your block's courtyard. Your day ends the way it started, accompanied by a Soviet anthem at midnight. You may turn the radio volume down if you want to go to bed early, but then you won't wake up for work, so for most people, syncing with the radio was worth it. This typical day is based on a 1981 American report comparing Soviet and US consumption data from 1976, which is a year in the middle of Brezhnev's golden era, while the US is at the peak of stagflation. So here we compare the best of the USSR with the worst of America. And even then, you can see that Soviet life is quite bland. The Soviet Union was a magnificent 19th century nation. People here were literate. They didn't die of flu or smallpox. They rode on buses and trains, and sometimes even cars. They had electricity and sewage. Okay, most of them did. But the USSR failed as a 20th century nation. Its consumer economy remained very weak, and devoid of goods most Westerners considered essential and basic. It could build tens of thousands of modern tanks, but couldn't supply its women with proper hygienic products. When the Iron Curtain fell, and the contrast between Western abundance and Soviet deficit became obvious, the Union fell too. Considering how mediocre the achievements of the Soviet economy were, the Bolsheviks needed a stark contrast with the USSR's predecessor to show their superiority, and thus created a lot of myths about the backwardness of the Russian Empire, which are quite popular even today, especially in Russia. In the next video, which will be the final one in the series, we will discuss the real situation in the Tsarist Empire on the eve of its collapse, and learn whether it was really that hopeless as the Bolsheviks claimed. I hope you found something new here and enjoyed the video. If you want to see more of that, please consider checking my other essays, especially the previous episodes of the series, and subscribing to this channel. Also, if you have any thoughts, I will be delighted to see them in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching.
Здесь женщины